Hello, everybody, and welcome to Health in the Family, week number 6, which means, of course, that if we're at week 6, it means we're pretty much at the middle point of the course in many respects. Um, Today, what I want to do is, because I can feel the way in which I've moved towards some sort of deep abstraction, and I can feel myself constantly guarded by moving too abstract because uh, let's say that sociological theory as the cornerstone of the discipline in many respects is not necessarily at the center of the sort of work that we do in sociology here at this particular university. And for that reason, it can be a little bit out there sometimes if we're not fully prepared to engage with it. And I totally get that. So what I want to do then is to one of two things. One, I want to provide a bit of a review of all of the moves that we've made until now as we've developed our own sociological perspective on health. And then I want to plug that into the material for this week, which is really just a development of what we've already been saying in many respects, but a development in some interesting directions having to do with gender and the division of labor. So I opened up this class, if you remember, with a discussion on the pandemic. I did that for almost all of my classes in one way or another, and I did touch upon the same sort of themes, and I'm not sure why those themes became important this particular semester for me as a teacher, but they seem to be of such significance because they were constantly kind of pushing themselves as concepts into my world. And I felt the need as a sociologist to do something with it. Why is it that the concepts of time and space and over proximity and so on seem to be so important in the context of the pandemic? And how can we use that new sort of position that's forced itself upon me, but also a lot of my colleagues? How can we make use of it to rethink the discipline of the sociology of health and of the family and sociology more generally? Um, so yeah, I opened up a discussion on the pandemic in this course, and I argued that we desperately need a specifically sociological account of health. This is of such significance to me now, as I highlight it more and more, that I feel the need to write it here so that you'll also take note of it. I'm talking about the importance of a specifically sociological account of health. And here I'm talking about health itself and not simply the social determinants of health, although that is also a sociological account of health. We're talking about a sociological account of the very concept of health. And that what I found was that during the period of the pandemic, we're perhaps afforded an opportunity to really make this point in a pressing way. And I claim that coronavirus demonstrated to those of us in the clinical psi professions, specifically psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and so on, but also professors in their own way, and all of us who work, I think, become attuned to this point in various ways. But the pandemic has opened up a space in which we could finally see that people are suffering from new issues and in new ways. They're being compressed into small spaces during the time of the pandemic. Some of us more than others. I would say at the very early part of the pandemic, all around the world, what people started to say was that it was a privilege to be able to social distance. For example, some people have a harder time social distancing, and we've amended what it means to to be engaged in social distancing. On the one hand, there's the concept of social distance that is used by health professionals, where we can socially distance ourselves in bubbles. On the other, there's the sociological concept of social distance, which isn't necessarily simply about bubbles, but also about social distance without those bubbles across various scales of the social system. So people were being compressed into small spaces with other people where their social interactions revealed a certain type of suffocation, social suffocation. And on the other hand, there was a sense in which people were losing their perspective on logical time, falling into a sense of timelessness. When did it begin? What's the date today? When does it end? And these two forms of suffering having to do with space and distance, proximity to one another in terms of our social interactions. And on the other hand, our social relationships in time, a feeling of time, when do I work? When should I sleep? When should I eat? When should I look after the family? All these sorts of things. It seemed to be really important that we have a space and time dimension to our sense of health and suffering. So we opened up a problem here at the very beginning, one that I didn't know at the time I was going to thread through the whole course in some sort of way, but this is kind of what I do in my teaching, is I find something singular in each course, and I try and build or invent a model with all of you and through the material that is quite singular for the course itself. And also, if we're lucky, maybe we can use it to generalize outside of the course, to extrapolate from our findings here to see how it can work in the world. So that was the first week of courses. In the second week of courses, we focused on the penultimate form of poor health, namely death. So we talked a lot about death in the second week, and we talked about that which is at the threshold of death, namely suffering, where suffering is, let's say, to some extent the road of death, although it doesn't always end there. But it's related, it's on the periphery of death in some particular way, some particularly important way. And I intimated that when we speak of health in the family, we're in fact speaking about the health of the family in terms of the integrity of the social bonds that occur within the family. And I indicated that if we were to take a holistic perspective in the sociological sense of what it means to be holistic, then we would have to situate the health of the family within the context of the health of its overarching society and the various social systems that exist within that society. But then I went a bit further. I went a bit forward, and I claimed that sociologists they've long been claiming that death is central to the formation of society and its various institutions, including the family. I took an example from Emil Durkheim. His observation, if you remember, was that when somebody dies, it seems to be a reason to renew or to construct a more integral, a more integrated social bond with one another, even if it's only fleetingly. There's something about death that provides us with more intense social bonds as a social group. You should remember Durkheim's remarks, and he extrapolated from these remarks, to build a sort of theory of, let's say, social health that we largely neglect in the American context. At the time of, or not long after somebody dies, we come together in certain types of rituals to construct bonds with one another. We hug each other, we come together, we discuss what it means to be a family again, and all of these various things. And that led us to the work of Zygmunt Bauman, Bauman, a contemporary sociologist who has had a lot to say about society and also about the family in terms of the liquid family structure, which lives in the midst of this contemporary period of what we might even refer to, what he refers to as liquid modernity. The liquid family structure means that it has changed. It has changed, and we have a much wider perspective now on what constitutes the family. Whereas before we had a more traditional understanding of a family. Bauman, you'll recall, claimed that all social institutions, indeed society as such, is a life strategy. Against death and against suffering. That's the point of a life strategy. It's a strategy toward life to avoid death and suffering. So all social institutions are involved in that particular way. This is why when we talk about their health, when we talk about the health of the family or any particular social institution or the health of society as such or any social bond, we're ultimately talking about what Bauman calls life strategies. And what I found here was that our health within society, but also within the family, has everything to do with how we relate to each other in space and in time. After this, in the same week, week 2, I gave an account of the various perspectives that we take together in our understanding of well-being in the family for this particular course, of which there were a couple. I'm not going to bring up whiteboard as much today. I know that it probably helps you to have whiteboard so you know what to write, but since this is a review, in some sense, I've already written it on the whiteboard, so hopefully you're just kind of following along as I point at all of the important things that I see in retrospect as we've moved to this point in the course. So these various perspectives that we were talking about in relation to well-being in the family had to do with on the one hand, the symbolic interactionist perspective, the ecological or family systems perspective, the life course perspective, and conflict theory. And of course, there's a hidden fifth one here, the psychoanalytic perspective. And we took something essential from each one of these perspectives. Number one, the symbolic interactionist perspective reminds us that we must examine the relationships and roles that we perform at a sort of micrological level in the context of the family, for example. Down on the ground, how do we maintain these roles, and what sort of strategies do we engage in to ensure that these roles are sustained adequately and that they don't fall into the anxiety of not knowing what our roles are? That's number one. Number two, what we took from the ecological or family systems perspective was a reminder that we must situate the family within a system of systems. There was a sense in which systems are systems of systems. There's systems everywhere, and we can speak about them abstractly. We can talk about work-family balance as a work-family system, for example. Systems always have within them other systems, and they're always situated within other systems, which are wider, perhaps. So we must always think about the interrelation of all of these systems across various scales. That's what we took from that perspective. Third, from the life course perspective, we were reminded that time changes things and our situations. We can't have a static account of health at a particular age or a particular period of society. We have to look at the history of individuals as much as the history of an evolution and changes that have occurred in social history as well. So we can't have a static account of well-being or health within the family, for example. The fourth one, conflict. Conflict perspectives reminded us that harmony and health and well-being are always a bit of a lie. They're a bit of a lie because there's always something that we're up against. There's always some suffering hidden there. For example, even there where the work-family balance wasn't such an issue in the gender division of labor, some people were suffering more to uphold that sense of health, namely women in the domestic sphere, and I'll talk more about that today. So there's always something that we're kind of up against there, and we have to be aware of that. Harmony and health is a bit of a ruse, and perhaps it's a necessary ruse. It's a necessary form of avoidance, but it's nonetheless there, and we shouldn't deceive ourselves that there are conflicts, fundamental conflicts that we need to examine. And then finally, there was the fifth perspective, the psychoanalytic perspective, or what I call psychoanalytic sociology, which allows us to abstract from the typical conflict perspective, which says that we're up against conflicts having to do with, say, resources, our identities, and so on, gender, class, whatever. But to abstract from that and to focus on death itself as that which health seeks to avoid. And that brings us to week number 3. Okay, in week 3, we spent week 3 developing a more nuanced perspective, a slightly more subtle perspective of psychoanalysis, kind of developing a little bit more the psychoanalytic sociological perspective. The psychoanalytic perspective demonstrated in the work of Sigmund Freud, particularly the text that we looked at, which was titled Family Romance, it was that alienation, which was a key concept from that week, is a sense of over proximity in our familial, not familiar, but familial, our family, social bonds. This over proximity is the space of a sense of timelessness. It's where timelessness occurs. So we're swallowed up, potentially swallowed up by the family. when we are alienated within the family. And whenever we are alienated, we might even extrapolate from this. I'm tempted to do it right now, even though we didn't discuss it. But whenever within society we discuss alienation, we might mean by alienation a sense in which we are swallowed up as individuals. So we're swallowed up by the family, by society, by the social system, if you like. And what we require is separation, which is the second concept. If we have alienation, which is being swallowed up, separation is when there's minimally some sort of attempt to separate. It may not be successful entirely, but there's an attempt to separate. When we separate, but we can't bear the consequences of separating, which means we still try hard to return to that union or something like that. We continue to suffer from what remains of that over proximity, of that connection, of that oneness. We get pulled back into the timelessness and over proximity of social bonds. So the Oedipus complex, you remember, we discussed that week as well, tangentially, because the family romance was an early stage in the development of Freud's Oedipus complex. It was an essential name for the distinctive type of, let's say, psychoanalytic suffering that occurs when we desire to return back to timelessness, to over proximity in our social bonds. And we criticize this approach of Freud's, not for its inaccuracies, but merely for its attempt to universalize this family romance or Oedipal complex, to universalize it without any awareness of various cultural alternative cultural configurations that may not be Oedipal. So it seems to lack a sense of cultural sensitivity. You know, for example, I'm not sure if I gave this example, I'm sure I did though. In India, much of the family structure is not about separating quite so much. Separation seems to be something we care a lot about in the West. It's consistent with modern theories of rationality where it's about separating. But in India, I mean, there's all kinds of cases of people who have children who are still living with the children still living with their grandparents, for example, and so on. Well, okay, so it seems to lack a sense of cultural sensitivity without getting too deep into that, which could be something we could discuss if any of you are particularly interested in it. But what we looked next at problems to our health that had to do with the work-family balance. The economics perspective, generally speaking, that comes out of the rational exchange theory, ran into the problem of asking how it is that everyday people can meaningfully or rationally decide today, in the contemporary context, of how and when to spend their time working or with the family. It seems as though there's no rational way to make that decision, even though there used to be. The individual cannot rationally weigh the costs and benefits of choosing family or work time in a given moment. It's all confusing for them today, which is why we have this problem, why we have so much sociological work focused on the work-family balance today. The anthropological literature, I hope you remember, demonstrated to us that framing the problem as a problem of work-life or work-family, where family seems to be a synonym for life in the work-life conceptual vocabulary, the problem of work-life completely misses the larger problem that gives rise to the problem of the work-life balance. You know, the very fact that we're trying to solve a work-life balance seems to have some sort of a priori, some sort of larger social determination. Work-family life as something that's causing us considerable strain and stress today has something to do with the movement of social history. When we focus only on the work-life balance and trying to rectify it at the local level, like how can I as an individual manage this new work-life conflict, we shouldn't miss the fact that there's something happening here that's much larger, perhaps in the world of capitalism or in the world of the social bond. And that's what's necessitating this problem for all of us. So we have new issues of time management, you remember. that we're all facing as a component of the work-family or work-life balance. And that has everything to do with a change that happened in history from what we call the more traditional or patriarchal, gendered division of labor. We'll just call it a more gendered division of labor, toward this new division of labor, which appears to be less gendered in some respects. Whereas our time used to be managed externally by the organization, the world of work, it's now become our responsibility and all of our responsibilities individually to manage our own time. In week 4, we advanced a little bit further. Or maybe I would say that we developed this a little bit more in more detail. We discussed the movement, and maybe I'm going to develop this a bit more today too, later. But in week 4, we discussed quite at length, I think, the movement of history, of social history, toward a blurring of the boundaries between work and the family as a significant obstacle to our well-being. It had clear implications for our social relationships in time and in space. Time used to be managed externally, and then it became shifted as a responsibility onto the employees themselves to manage their own time increasingly. We're not totally in that situation, but increasingly we can see this movement, this change, this adjustment. And the problem of timelessness became something that we all had to manage. The world of work didn't extract us from the problem of timelessness by managing our time for us. Time management was a key word now. That meant there's no external management of our time by somebody other than ourselves, at least no hard external management. Similarly, space and spacelessness, or over proximity, became a real issue as the workplace became a place responsible for helping us with our families, and vice versa. Our families became responsible for helping us in our work world in some hidden ways, or we became more attentive to the fact that they were. We looked at the movement that we looked at the movement of or maybe the trends whereby childcare became externalized outside of the home. It became more privatized or subsidized. And we saw the changing nature of the family, more single parent families, more diverse family structures, and so on. And here what I tried to do was I began to open up the possibility of that timelessness and spacelessness, or over proximity. I seem to be changing the word over proximity to spacelessness, because what I realized is that simply being overly proximate is just as bad as being totally disconnected from the social bond. So spacelessness and timelessness are sites of social trauma. I'm not necessarily talking about psychological trauma or biological trauma, like a super hard impact to the body that can traumatize the body at a biological level, or a psychological trauma that could be triggered by any number of psychological issues. Or relational issues. I argued that trauma, sociologically speaking, is the experience of a certain timelessness that repeats, a certain spacelessness that repeats. We cannot shake the trauma because there's something about it that is timeless, that feels eternal. It keeps repeating. It's repeating precisely because we can't separate from the time of the trauma, from the space of the trauma. In some sense, it's still with us. It's a remnant that we carry with us. It sticks to us. I argued that the old split, and this word split seems to be of increasing significance, the old split that constituted our separation, that allowed us to separate from in time and space, to have a sense of time as a discretely chopped up thing. There's now, there's later, there's before, there's 9 to 5, there's time for the family, time for work. We can split it up. I argued that the old split that constituted our separation from time and space was made, at least in part and quite significantly in part, by gender. There was a gendered division of labor, and perhaps still is, but in a new way. And we looked at a lot of statistics to demonstrate this fact. The trajectory was such that the vast majority of working people must now look after their families while they work. And that has serious repercussions for our health and well-being, and not just our own, but the well-being and health of the various members of our family, and indeed of the family as such. So we saw how multitasking, another key concept, multitasking has become a skill that we all must now have. We didn't talk about multitasking as much in the past as we do now. Finally, our textbook, using empirical evidence to support our theoretical abstractions, made a remarkable claim that bolsters our sociological theory. And I quoted it. One of the authors of one of the chapters said that our families have become timeless, literally timeless, they said. And I really liked that. I don't think they knew what they were saying entirely when they said it. They knew what they were saying in the context of the empirical data, but not in the context of this sociological account that I'm trying to put together for us. If I keep doing this, it seems like I'm saying something very profound. American families have become literally timeless. I think that was the quote. I ended that class with an anecdote about the way in which the year 2020 has become not so much a year, but a timeless period, defined by a certain social trauma. It's a year that doesn't seem to end, hence why my friend keeps counting the days of 2020. It's like today's December something, 70th, or I don't know, 2020. It's like the year 2021 didn't really happen. We didn't get yet that sense of a break from the old regime, whether it's a political regime or the regime of the pandemic, whatever the heck you want to call it. It's like we're still in it. There was no new year. Incidentally, I didn't hear a lot about New Year's resolutions this year for some reason. I don't know if you did. I don't remember hearing too much about New Year's resolutions. But it's as if we're still stuck inside of it, as if there was no new year. In week 5, I tried to provide you finally with a distinctively sociological definition of health that moves further than a more simplistic definition of sociology, as concerned only with the social determinants of health. In the American continent, I remember saying, whenever we talk about health, we seem to always reduce it to the sociological or the social determinants of health. It's as though, yes, we can be sociological, but in the final instance, we ultimately talk about health biologically. The social determinants of health on what? The lungs? Yes, there's social reasons why people of particular races or social classes tend to suffer in particular biological ways. And this is an important way of thinking sociologically, absolutely. Extremely important. But can sociology have its own notion or concept of health, independent of the biological definition, but nonetheless inclusive of it, nonetheless having an ability to speak on its own terms in relation to biological and psychological versions of health? I argued that health can be understood not only biologically, medically, and psychologically. Like when a psychologist talks about health, they actually adopt a psychological definition of health. They might talk about anxiety, strictly speaking, as a psychological definition of health, or of challenge to health, just as a naive example. If a biologist talks about health, they have their own version of talking about what health is, right? So they'll talk about the health of the lungs or something like that, of the organs, of the physiology. Again, very naive. I understand that. I'm just trying to make a point. Well, what is the concept of health that's sociological then? You can think about that. Well, it must have something to do with the wellness of our social relationships. It must. We see that the World Health Organization, or we saw that the World Health Organization gave social health its own domain, its own place, alongside biological and psychological. And I think that gives us some reason to think that our own unique notion of health should be of some importance and shouldn't be reducible in the final analysis to psychological or biological definitions of health. I provided an abstract version of health having to do, sociological health, having to do with integration and regulation, social integration and social regulation in space and time through the work of the classical French sociologist Émile Durkheim. My argument from Durkheim was that a social bond is healthy when there's some balance, not too integrated, not too disintegrated, not too regulated, not too anarchic or without regulation. It must, at both ends, avoid being swallowed up completely or separated completely, regulated completely, or complete freedom. This definition of health expands upon our sense of health in space and time by giving it more contours. I returned after that to the idea of the family as a system and a life strategy, and demonstrated using statistical evidence that the family and marriage serves to protect its members from mortality, from death and suffering. Yet it clearly does so in different ways, right? And to a greater or lesser extent, or to the greater or lesser advantage of its various members. Men clearly benefit the most from the family and from marriage. The evidence points in that direction. The workplace threatens, it seems, the life strategy of the family in this perspective, especially when there's not a good work-family culture installed. The idea of work-family culture was important because it meant that the workplace would allow the family to continue to do what it does, to continue to function as a life strategy, and that's where we kind of stopped. That brought us up to today. What I want to do is see how much further we can get with this theory as we move through some more material in the coming weeks, see if we can hold on to this theory, this perspective. I hope that this short review, well, it was quite long actually, but it's a little different than going through each class one by one. This ties all of those classes together. I hope that provides some sort of consistency to what we've been doing up until now, and maybe a little bit more clarification despite the, as I always say, the abstraction. Overall, what this has done is it has allowed us in this class our own provocative sociological perspective and theory that's been capable of allowing us to think about the family and health in a strictly sociological way. Okay, so for this week, I have on the syllabus a number of documents, which we won't, of course, go through in detail, at least not all of them, it's just too much. And but they're there as supporting documents for the ideas that we're developing this week. And we'll see if we can take from this material something to help us on our journey on what we're trying to do here. The topic for this week, of course, is gender. Yeah, you can see, I hope, how gender has been a very important concept for prior weeks in various ways, even if it was kind of in the background sometimes. And why? Well, gender was at the center in some respects of this movement that brought us to speak of the liquid family, and in the context of new time management strategies. You know, gender first off is is a means of social stratification. It's a means of it's a way of stratifying society in such a way that you can build life strategies in space and time. You put one gender over in one area, like let's say women, you put that women in one area, and then you can put another gender in another area. This is a very simplistic conception, of course, and today we obviously have a much different understanding in the popular imagination of what gender is. But we're talking about the more traditional conception. Gender was, and still is to some degree, a means of stratifying society to build a life strategy in space and time by putting one gender over there. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to keep it relatively simple in the household. In the context of the family, for example, put the other gender in the workplace, or in the context of public society, if you like. So you're putting one gender over there in space, and the other one, as a consequence, goes in another space. And you're doing that for a period of time, right? So, for example, the workplace, let's put it just simply 9 to 5, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's a time dimension to this, right? And then after 5 p.m., of course, after the time separation, you go back to the other space. Well, gender helped at this time to produce a situation in which there was this externally regulated space of time, namely the 9 to 5. So that's in a nutshell how it used to be. But of course, things are changing. And with the collapse of the old gender division of labor, we obviously run into the problem of not knowing how to situate social relationships in space and time again. There's a sense in which to make something great again, when you hear that expression, what does it mean? It means to return to a traditional mode of stratification. And it's not clear that that's what we want to do. I'm not exactly sure that we can, it's not even clear that we can go back to this way of doing things, even if we want it to, right? And I'm not saying that we certainly shouldn't want to, because clearly there's disadvantages to one particular side of this partition, which we can examine more in a moment. So let's turn now to some material from this week. As if I didn't already say that, I guess. But in particular, I wanted to look at this piece that comes out of Feminist Frontiers. And the title of it is, I guess I should have left whiteboard open. The title is COVID-19 and the Gender Gap in Work Hours. It's from Feminist Frontiers. Of course, it's a piece that was just published not long ago. It's extremely up-to-date article, and the authors they're all American. They're not Canadian, as far as I could tell. It gives a really interesting argument, which is as follows: COVID-19 has caused people to retreat into their homes, such that caregiving responsibilities are not so easily externalized anymore. Well, this is a point we've made theoretically. Now we're finding some empirical evidence that bolsters that argument. And it's given rise to the following result. I'm going to quote the authors. Mothers with young children have reduced their work hours to 4 to 5 times more than fathers. And the gender gap in work hours has grown by 20 to 50%. Well, that seems quite significant. We see that the old gendered division of labor has resurfaced to some extent, but within the context of the home this time. The split is happening in the home. So when times get rough, childcare work seems to fall back upon women, mothers. We can compare this with the division of labor before and after COVID-19 in Canada. So if this is an article in the American context, what about Canada? Well, an article published in mid-November of 2020 from 3 Canadian scholars discusses these trends, and I didn't post this online. If anybody wants this article, I'd be happy to share it with you. But what this article states, and it seems to be supported by a few other studies that I've read, but it's happening in the Canadian context this time, right? It puts forward the claim that the pandemic has actually demonstrated that the gender division of labor on the whole has not quite reappeared. I'm quoting. Our results, and again, these are based on survey data and so on. Our results do not seem to, that the gendered division of domestic labor for Canadian parents became more unequal during the early months of the pandemic. Well, notice the wording, during the early months of the pandemic. Rather, it appears that many Canadian fathers initially took, again, the word is initially took, on more domestic labor. If they shifted to home-based paid work and were exposed to the needs of their children and families. Okay, but they're arguing that the short-term results may nonetheless reveal that the domestic labor was gendered and was adversely affecting mothers. I'm quoting the article, that's why I put that. So there's still some indication. It's not like we've completely gotten rid of the gender division of labor. It seems to be obscured a little bit. And that might be an interesting thesis to pick up. Has the gender division of labor been obscured? That's, well, a global news article, it's a Canadian news, published on October the 20th, 2020, a story, and I'm quoting it, mothers taking on shocking number of hours caring for children during the pandemic. That's the title of the news. So here it seems to confirm that mothers seem to be adversely affected in terms of care work, family work, childcare work, and it's a much more dramatic article, and it comes out of a study from McMaster University, which found that while both fathers and mothers were taking on more caregiving responsibilities during the lockdown, so it's true that both of them seem to be. That's a change, and we should note that that is a change. But nonetheless, mothers were taking on the vast majority of it. And the amount of time caregiving shifted in the following way. Men, I'm not going to write this, but if you want to take note of this, it's fine. Men were involved in 33 hours per week of caregiving work before the pandemic and 46 hours after the pandemic. So an already low number increased a little bit from 33 to 46 hours. Women, by contrast, were involved in 68 caregiving hours per week before the pandemic. Well, that's quite a high number, an extremely high number. I mean, that's more than double what men were doing. And 95 after. Well, that's an even higher increase, right? I can't even believe that number. I guess I could dig in and see how they did the study to see why these numbers and results tend to be a little bit different. But we can read this critically, if we like, through our theoretical model of the various perspectives that we've been kind of building together throughout the course. Well, perhaps our thesis might be that the old gendered division of labor, which stratified social interactions in space and time, does not function in the same way today. I think that's a modest argument, except when the potentially timeless and spacelessness sets in, which is the time of the pandemic, there's perhaps an attempt sometimes to reinstall, or there's an attempt to reinstall the old gender binary, often to the benefit of one side of that binary and to the detriment of the other. So our responsibility, therefore, is to find our ethical, perhaps, responsibility is to find a new means of interacting in space and time that extracts us from the timelessness, from the spacelessness, from the over proximity of the family, of our children, and so on, but without recourse to the old regressive gendered division of labor. So if I haven't convinced you yet of this overarching theoretical position, then I guess what I'd like to do is point at another trend that has emerged in the midst of the pandemic. I'm going to pause the video to see if I can find the news article that I want to discuss. Okay, I have found the article. So it's a new trend that has emerged in the time of the pandemic that I want to bring your attention to. It seems relevant. I hope it's not too provocative for you. It has to do with the exponential sale of sex dolls, which are a new thing, I guess. It's an argument that struck me one day while reading Google News. I guess it was November the 8th of 2020. This article written by Vice, which Vice tends to be news geared toward, let's say, younger people who who are interested in more provocative news, perhaps. Well, it's an argument that struck me while reading this. I brought it to the attention of a contemporary sociologist named Slavoj Žižek, Z-I-Z-E-K, who then used my ideas actually to write a chapter in his really popular book on the pandemic, titled Pandemic. Well, Vice magazine reports that COVID-19 lockdowns have led to a huge spike in these dolls. What's most fascinating about it is that those who are purchasing them are going to married couples during the time of the pandemic. This little detail seems to be quite significant. Why? I'm going to break out of this because I don't want to stare at this screen anymore. Why is it significant? Well, it says something. My hypothesis, and it's the hypothesis that Žižek picked up in his book, is that these dolls are functioning precisely and paradoxically to interrupt the intensity, that is the over proximity of the marriage relationship in the home. In other words, the doll installs a distance in space and time, a time away from the sexuality of the couple. I'm going to quote Slavoj Žižek here, who, of course, this is a really shameless thing to do, and I apologize, but who's quoting me in the article, in the chapter. And it goes like this, quote, "The obvious explanation seems sufficient. With all the social distancing imposed in response to the pandemic, people are avoiding direct physical contact." That seems to be what you would imagine, right? However, a detail mentioned in the report undermines this explanation. The vast majority of these dolls are sold to married couples. How can this be? Dwayne Roussel, that's me, suggests the clue resides in the fact that, quote, "most of us feel more intensely connected to one another during the pandemic than ever before," end quote. The exploding of doll sales, quote, "is therefore exemplary rather of an attempt amidst the overly connected nature of the pandemic to produce a barrier to the oneness of the sexual relationship. These are not meant to overcome the sexual relationship, but to plug up and slow down the intensity of our access to real life sexual encounters," end quote. So I hope you see the point. We're living in a time when something like sex, for example, undoubtedly is much easier to access than it ever has been before. So even before the pandemic, we're seeking out, without realizing it, means of interrupting that over proximity, that means of introducing a gap or a distance from it in terms of the social relationship. I'll give you another example. Take the light phone. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I'm going to see if I can find it on Google. Share my screen. Okay, here's the light phone. It's not quite as popular as it used to be, but for a short time it was incredibly popular. And this was before the pandemic, much before the pandemic. You see this, designed to be used as little as possible. A phone for humans. Well, how it works. Let's get to it. I'm just going to bring up a photo of it first. Okay, here it is. I see the price has dropped remarkably for this. Oh, it's a used one, that's why. I don't know if you can see that. Let's get another one. Oh, this is the Light Phone 2 in this photo. Okay, so it seems to have a bit more functionality. So what is the Light Phone? It's described as your phone away from phone. It's just, or when it came out, it was just as expensive as an iPhone. I think it was $800 or something like that, except that it uses less expensive parts. As you can see, it uses one of those e-ink types of interfaces that you see on an e-reader, on the earlier, older e-readers, so that the battery can last much longer. So it's just as expensive as an iPhone, except it doesn't include any functionality except for text messaging and phone calls. I see iPhone 2 includes an alarm now. In other words, you're buying the phone precisely because of what it doesn't allow you to do. Our regular phones sometimes make us feel overloaded because there's too much happening all at once. Messages on WhatsApp, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter. We're getting all these notifications all the time. In other words, there's too much social interactions. There's too much intensity to our social bonds. We feel too connected to each other, overly proximate to one another. The light phone, then, I claim, was meant, though nobody realized it, as a tool, as a social tool for health and well-being. It aimed to install a distance, some space from those intense social relationships by prohibiting them, by not allowing you to have access to them. And we're willing to pay a lot of money for that type of distance. Well, it's similar in some respects to the example that I gave before this one, right? Okay, well, what else can we say about gender, though? Well, chapter 22, it seems to me in the textbook, if you're following along, not that important, but it gives a very nice historical overview of the gender division of labor. The title of that chapter is Gender Perspectives on Work and Personal Life Research. In this particular chapter, I think we get a really nice overview of the movement of the division of labor from a more strictly gendered one to a more complex, but nonetheless still gendered in some respects, division of labor. I would encourage you to read this chapter. I tell you, you don't have to read all the chapters. This chapter, I think it would be really nice if you would read it, if you have access to it. It's okay, again, if you don't, or if you want to go back and read it for your research, but every now and then there comes along a chapter that I think is especially important, and I think this is one of them. I would encourage you to read this one intently from the beginning to the end. There's a long history of the separation of genders within society, of course. We can trace it back really far. You know, Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels, well, it was mostly Engels, he traced it back to a very particular moment in history quite a long time ago, emerging in, let's say, primitive, what he called primitive societies, what anthropologists at the time were calling primitive societies, what today we would say are more indigenous societies. But very early in agrarian and pre-industrial societies, the biological features of the body were used precisely as a justification or rationalization, often without any question, for the gendered division of labor, for this type of stratification of society. There were apparently unshakable convictions about what constituted masculinity and what constituted femininity. And there was a separation, whiteboard time. There was a separation this line represents a cut or a separation, or if you like, a split. There was a separation between what was considered more feminine and what was considered more masculine. A separation between what was considered more of a public sphere in society and what was considered more of a private sphere in society. The public sphere tended to be the one dedicated to work, to the production of things within a social bond that would satisfy personal needs. You know, we're making things like toothpaste and so on out here in the public sphere, would be the idea. And the private sphere tended to be the place where there was more consumption of those needs, personal needs. But it's also the place where there's more care work. I wouldn't say social work. I'm just going to leave it blank. Okay. Well, the first thing we notice is that there is a split, right? You can clearly see the split right here. It's like a line drawn in the sand. And the split, I want to call it a split, and this is what differentiates my approach, which I'm calling a psychoanalytic sociological approach, from that of the author of this chapter, who, and indeed all of the authors that we've discussed from the textbook. The term split comes out of contemporary psychoanalytic theory, particularly the work of somebody named Jacques Lacan. Well, what is a split? First, let me give you the example. Out of oneness, the public is split from the private. That's a split. A split or a splitting occurs whenever there's a separation from oneness, whenever we're separated from the oneness of time and space, from timelessness, from spacelessness. It's quite a different thing to claim that there's a splitting than to claim that there is a binary. So in a sense, what I'm saying is I'm putting the idea of a binary up against the idea of a split, which I claim are sort of two different ideas. The author discusses this in terms of a binary. It clearly looks like a binary. There's this and there's that, right? But when you talk about a split, you're talking about the introduction of one thing, which is a line that produces the idea of a binary. A split comes before a binary then, logically, right? A binary or a dichotomy, another word that describes this two-ness of it. A split seems to indicate something about the causation of binaries and dichotomies. A split is a way of separating oneself from timelessness, from spacelessness, from over-proximity. One splits oneself, separates oneself as a social group from the alienation of the social bond. So, for example, when we talk about a public and a private sphere, as I did in this example, the very idea of splitting something off and producing a public sphere is what gave rise to the alternative idea of there being a private sphere. It's not that just one day, one fine day, someone decides that there's this over here, a private sphere, and there's a public sphere over there. Not at all. It doesn't quite work like that. The public sphere as the valued sphere of social utility, the sphere of work and economic utility, must, as a consequence, separate itself from something that is not, strictly speaking, valued in the same way. That's the split. Take, for example, the work of Habermas. Jürgen, how do you spell his name? Jürgen Habermas? I think you spell it like that. Jürgen Habermas. Habermas was a very important sociologist in our tradition, one that we seldom read about these days. He had all kinds of interesting ideas, just like Zygmunt Bauman, Freud, and other thinkers we encounter provisionally in this course. But what is most important today is that Habermas thought a great deal about the emergence of the public sphere. How it came into being, the masculine public sphere, if you like, how it came into being. Of course, feminists were criticizing Habermas's work at the time, and for good reason, because he seemed somewhat blindsided by the idea that the public sphere was essentially masculine. Where were the women? And it's not clear that Habermas initially had a satisfying answer to that. And it's true, this is where Habermas was short-sighted, but let's nonetheless look at the idea for a moment. I hope first that you notice that Habermas described the public sphere as a sphere, S-P-H-E-R-E, for a reason. It's because it's a delimited zone for him of discussion, a space of intellectual discussion for Habermas. For Habermas, the public sphere was an essential social space where people could meet for a certain amount of time to discuss their work, mostly intellectual work. That was the idea of a public sphere for him. But in doing so, the people who enter into the public sphere are obligated they're obligated to leave behind their private troubles. That's the cost of admission into the public sphere, that you separate yourself from the private troubles and enter into the public sphere. You have to leave behind all of your private prejudices, all of your private biases, and so on, to enter into the more rational intellectual discussions and debates that happen in the public sphere. We can see already that to construct a public sphere, it's necessary that it have this social space that stands outside of itself to deposit all of this stuff that it is not. If you have to be rational when you enter the public sphere, then you have to deposit all the irrational stuff somewhere else. You have to produce something when you produce the public sphere. You have to produce something that negates it, that isn't it, that is against it, perhaps, another sphere. So for Habermas, the public sphere is a place of social interactions that occur. Maybe I'll write this. Space of social interactions. For him, it's largely intellectual, that occur in space and time, or let me think about it a little differently, that splits itself off in space and time from the private sphere, and that in doing so, therefore, produces the very idea of a private sphere. It's a place of the public sphere is a place of ethical discussion, according to Habermas. It's a place of dialogue and debate and rationality. It's a place where academic and intellectual knowledge is produced and legitimated. Perhaps in many respects, it was the modern classroom. The modern classroom you can think of concretely as something like a public sphere, but also academic journals. Like you don't go in an academic journal and talk about your private issues, hopefully. It's going to go through some sort of a peer review process among others who rationally engage with it and debate about it, and then it can go into publication and be public. Well, the private life, the private sphere, became understood as the space of intensity, the space of personal connections, the space that is perhaps closer to being timeless and spaceless in that sense, and more dangerous. The public sphere is the space of rational dialogue. It's freed from emotions. The private sphere is intensely emotional then. To enter into the public sphere, you have to leave behind that intensity. You have to leave behind the emotions. I'm quoting Habermas. He literally wrote, "You must leave it all behind." Leave all of that behind is what he wrote. So he made it quite obvious. Habermas was tracing a historical movement. There was always a public, what he called the public, which is different from the public sphere. There was always a public, but there wasn't always a private sphere, and there wasn't always a public sphere, but there was always a public, according to Habermas. The private had to be produced at the moment when there emerged a public sphere. In the beginning, the public was simply, for Habermas, the public face of power. It's the place of the state, of the exercise of power, of monarchy or monarchical authority, repressive authority. The public sphere, by contrast to the public as such, is a space where you can mediate between the authority of the public and the people who are situated in their families, perhaps in the household, in the private sphere. So it's a place of mediation between the public and the private sphere. And it was meant to, according to Habermas, I'm quoting, counterbalance cultural assumptions, normative attitudes, which are ethical positions, collective prejudices and values, but also to counterbalance the power of the state. In the high Middle Ages, the public sphere was not distinct from the private sphere then. There was as of yet no understanding of a public sphere or a private sphere. There was only the public. For instance, Habermas wrote, I'm quoting him, "Nevertheless, it was not coincidental that during that period, symbols of sovereignty, for instance, the princely seal, were deemed public. At that time, there existed a public representation of power. The status of the feudal lord, at whatever level of the feudal pyramid, was oblivious to the categories of public and private, but the holder of the position represented it publicly. He showed himself, presented himself as the embodiment of an ever-present higher power," end quote. So what happened? Well, the feudal authorities, which was the churches, the princes, members of nobility, and so on, these are all the public, they themselves were separated, put into antagonism with one another, polarized. They broke themselves into a public and private elements. So this splitting happened at the level of the public. The public split into two compartments, the public sphere, the private sphere. And suddenly in English, we get expressions like what happens in your home is your own business. It's private, like, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas or whatever. That in a nutshell is Habermas's theory. You can see it involves a logic of splitting. What we add to it is that gender is essential to the integrity of that split. So when you hear, for example, some feminists, and one that I like to quote a lot in this and other courses is Simone de Beauvoir. I hope I'm spelling this right. I think I am this time. Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote that woman is not herself her gender. There's only, for Simone de Beauvoir, there's actually only one gender. At least that's a part of her argument. Well, that's a complicated thing to think, right? There's only one gender. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you think about gender not in terms of binary or dichotomy, as the author did, but in terms of splitting, then gender is always masculine in this perspective. This is a really counterintuitive argument. Gender is always masculine, except that which is not masculine, which gets deposited into the category of woman as a private sort of space where anything that's not gender can go. So everything that is not man must be deposited somewhere after there's a splitting. So you can say there's men and then there's the other sex. Hence, we have the title of Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking book, The Other Sex. In the same way, the private sphere was split from the public sphere, and everything that was not the public sphere was deposited into the private sphere. Label it, we could even call it the other sphere instead of the private sphere. It's the other sphere, right? So you can see how splitting is essential to understanding the way in which one can emerge from timelessness and spacelessness and over proximity of a social bond. And this splitting can occur in any number of ways. Perhaps where gender is one possible way of dividing or separating oneself, dividing labor, for example. Hence, in chapter 23 for this week from the textbook, we see a really interesting argument. The gendered division of labor in this case is, we're talking about the gendered division of labor within the household and not simply in society at large. Let's talk about gendered division of labor in the household, in the family, if you like. Well, if we're looking just within the household, let's say what used to be called the private sphere, within the household, the gender division in there is quite interesting. It has something to do with time availability, according to this author. Time availability is used as a rational way of dividing labor within the household by gender. The basic idea is that the gendered household divisions of labor, in terms of such things as, when we're talking about labor in the household, we're talking about such things as care work, family work, emotional work, these sorts of things that are hard to define in utilitarian terms and according to a rational exchange theory perspective. How can you quantify, for example, being cared for? It's a qualitative thing in many respects. Well, this sort of gendered division of labor where within the household, in terms of, say, family work, looking after children, caring for people, and so on, it tends to be upheld in a gendered way precisely because of this rationalization that we sometimes see, that women have more time, men have less time. Okay, we're talking about the more traditional patriarchal structure of the family here, not in a more contemporary perspective, because of course we have here only two genders, and we could go and we could complicate this and try and bring it up to date, which I think we should, but right now we're not at that moment yet. We're talking about the gender division of labor within the household, and the rationalization has tended to be that women have more time, therefore they can dedicate that extra time to care work, family work, emotional work, to have more time. Men have less time, so they can't. That tends to be the arguments you tend to hear. So in other words, women must do it because they're in some sense closer to being timeless, to having a surplus of time, having too much time, spaceless because they don't have to go outside the home, perhaps. So the author of chapter 22 creates an interesting table of justifications, separating these two broader spheres of private and public, domestic and occupational work. And I think we should just quickly look at it before wrapping up to see how, let's say, discursively one could rationalize, or one maybe not could, but tries to rationalize this type of division, say between the public and the private, or between the occupational world and the domestic world. Well, in the occupational world, we tend to say something like, a work is an obligation. Whereas in the domestic world, work tends to be seen as a choice or as a desire. Okay, we should be criticizing this and scrutinizing it, of course, but we're just talking about at the level of discourse, what we tend to hear, right? Money tends to be the motivation. Whereas in the domestic world, love, caring tends to be the motivation. Work is paid. Work is unpaid. There's a certain type of rational discussions of that type of work, whereas here it tends to be more emotionally discussed. Tends to be more abstract here and tends to be more concrete and concerned with the everyday. Tends to be defined in terms of a time span. Here, time is more ambiguous. You tend to produce commodities here. Here you tend to produce people. And people might end up being commodities. You tend to think in terms of skills on this side. And on this side, you tend to think about innate abilities, perhaps. Here we tend to think that things are more complex. And over here, we tend to think that things are more simple. There's any number of ways of drawing this table. And of course, we can criticize it intensely and easily. But you can see the way in which this can serve a certain ideological function, if you like. I think this is where I'm going to stop, which is, a place where I'm somewhat challenging some of the ideas I've been stringing along, whether you're aware of it or not, and see where we can pick up next week. I certainly hope all of you are doing well, and thanks so much for following me along in this interesting mode of discovery where we're producing a new sociological way of speaking about these things together. It's quite exciting in certain ways on my end. So thank you so much, and you will see me soon, and I hope to talk to many of you soon too. Bye-bye.